2026 is a massive year for the history of video games. Anniversaries of some of the biggest, most unique, and significant gaming franchises in the world. The unique strategy and isolation of the original Pikmin, the friendly frights of Luigi's Mansion, making a mark in an unfamiliar community in Animal Crossing, Sonic the Hedgehog further cementing himself as one of gaming's most unique mascots with some of the highest highs across gaming, Hollywood, and more, while sharing some of the most baffling lows and oddities you'd be hard-pressed to find elsewhere in the genre. Castlevania and Kid Icarus were introduced to the world, the former starting a trilogy on the NES with two of the system's hardest but best level-based platformers, and eventually spawning a franchise with expansive level design and lore behind it that fans are still chomping at the bit to see fully explored today, and the latter not featuring nearly as many games or having as large of an impact, but its revitalization in the late 2000s and early 2010s resulted in some awesome fighters and mechanics for Super Smash Bros., as well as one of the 3DS's most unique and memorable action experiences. Some of the biggest names celebrating birthdays this year are The Legend of Zelda, a series synonymous with video games and action-adventure regardless of your familiarity with the genre. Metroid, a series that's had its lulls and droughts in terms of content, but has a passionate and ravenous fanbase always ready to continue the mission to purge the galaxy of alien threats. Persona took a while to catch on, but thanks to a consistent effort from Atlus, the series slowly but surely became a mainstay in the gaming space and has captured audience attention with each new release. And of course, there's the biggest one, Pokémon. Turning 30 years old, Pokemania has infected the world so thoroughly that announcements for new games can strangle discussion in gaming spaces for months on end regardless of if people end up playing those games or not. Pikachu is as recognizable to general audiences as Mario and Mickey Mouse. But there's one anniversary this year that I think is going to be more important than all of the others. One that I think genuine fans of the video game medium and its history will acknowledge appropriately, but will be comparatively understated compared to the larger successes of those like Persona and Pokemon. But without this series, without its vision, its innovations, and its popularity, those series would not be able to shine quite as brightly as they do today. The torch they carry is one kindled, carefully, and masterfully by another equally important franchise. From the minds of Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura comes one of the most influential titles and series in video game history. This is Dragon Quest. The story of Dragon Quest begins over a decade before the game would even hit store shelves. In 1975, Yasuhiro Fukushima would found the Aidensha Boshu Service Center, and it would be focused on the publishing of real estate tabloids. Stick with me. 5 years later, the company would create a subsidiary, Eidansha Fudosan, later renamed to Eidansha Systems, which specialized in real estate trades and brokerage. After unsuccessfully attempting to become a national brand in 1981, Fukushima would take a step back and reevaluate his plans with the company. He elected to pivot into the emerging video game market, and would rename Eidansha Systems to Enix Corporation, a play on the words Phoenix, symbolizing the company's rebirth akin to the mythological beast of the same name, and the ENIAC computer that was created in 1945 as the first programmable, electronic, general-purpose digital computer. 1982 was the first year Enix would attempt to recruit talent for its new venture, but instead of posting job listings and interviewing hopeful creatives, Fukushima opted to go about things a bit differently. He would host a competition, the Enix Game Hobby Program Contest that would offer a cash prize of 1 million yen if you managed to be selected as a winner. All contestants had to do was submit a prototype of a game to Enix, and winners would then have the opportunity to finish their prototypes for Enix to package and publish to the mass market. Developers would not be hired on as full employees, instead being paid upfront for their winning submissions and royalties for every sale of the completed product. It was a winning formula for Enix, who received 300 submissions by the end of the contest and wound up choosing 13 winners, all of which were published the following year in February of 1983. One of the 13 winners was Koichi Nakamura, who submitted the title Door Door, a puzzle game that saw players controlling a small egg-like protagonist named Chun, who was attempting to corral monsters into the titular doors that would trap them inside safely away from Chun. The game was a deeply challenging and addictive title, with later levels requiring near-perfect play to beat, lest the game softlock and force the player to restart. With 50 levels, the title offered a lot of challenge for players and lots of replayability to get as far as possible with the highest score. The first version Enix published on PC was a critical and commercial hit, with the PC 8801 version selling 200,000 units alone. Another winner of the contest was Yuji Horii with his title Love Match Tennis. A much simpler game than Door Door, it was a tennis simulator that let players play tennis singles with basic controls and commands. Horii and Nakamura's success in the contest convinced most of them to continue developing games and pivot from it being a hobby to a full-on career for them. Nakamura would continue working on Door Door, porting it to other computer systems and increasing his royalties earned from the project, so much so that he earned 10 million yen from it as a university student. Horii would take the success from Love Match Tennis and use it to finish another title of his, one that would prove far more popular and influential not only to Horii's future prospects, but video games as a medium. Horii had started work on this project years ago in 1981, before Enix had even announced their contest or pivot into gaming. Noticing the lack of text-based adventure games in the Japanese market compared to its bloom overseas, he wanted to not only bring the genre to Japan, but do it in a way that would allow the player to drive the story more than if it was a standard linear novel. Horii's initial vision for the title had him envisioning players almost conversing with the computer, having it learn and adapt to the player's own actions in order to give each player a more unique experience. Of course, that was far too ahead of its time then, and even now with the rise of language learning models in pop culture, it's unlikely a commercially released video game could ever truly act in the way Horii envisioned all those years ago. Instead, Horii would end up having the game be 1/5 linear storytelling and 4/5 optional content that the player could choose how to interact with. The Portopia serial murder case would see players attempting to solve a murder through careful investigation and deduction, with the 1983 PC release having players type in commands to their computer in order for the game to discern what was to happen next. Told in a first-person perspective, the game would display scenes and describe them as if in a novel in order to give players as much of a picture as possible with the limited graphical displays of the time. In order to progress, players would need to type the appropriate phrases in a text parser that required a verb and noun to get the computer to understand and act upon said commands. The game was notably non-linear, with players being able to explore an open world in any order they want and find evidence and talk to suspects in any order they wanted. The game would go on to be a modest success on PC, but it was 2 years later in 1985 when the game would come to the Nintendo Famicom that the Portopia serial murder case would become the influential juggernaut it is today. To bring the game to the Famicom, Horii went to fellow Enix contest winner and newly minted founder of the development company Chunsoft, Koichi Nakamura. Nakamura and Horii were aware of each other thanks to their contest victory and subsequent publishing, but Nakamura had been able to take his success with Door Door and turn it into a company to call his own, named after the main character from his inaugural published title. Horii and Nakamura originally didn't plan on porting Portopia, instead wanting to publish a role-playing game for the system due to their enthusiasm for games like Ultima and Wizardry, but Enix was a bit hesitant at the idea. The Famicom's audience was much younger than that of PC, thanks to the ease of use and simplicity of the controller compared to a keyboard. That controller also meant that inputs were much more restricted, and would limit the abilities of both developers and players when it came to the full potential the genre could theoretically reach. Nakamura and Horii knew that in order to make Portopia work on the Famicom, they'd need to make some changes. First, Horii would remove the text parser and replace it with a more intuitive, menu-based system that restricted the player's input options but kept them from getting stuck. Instead of needing to type the exact word or phrase to progress, the player was only presented with options relevant to the task at hand. While not all of them were correct, it meant that players would still be able to experience the non-linear optional interactions Horii envisioned without needing the player to infer what objects and landmarks were interactable beforehand. Another change this version had compared to the original release was a dungeon crawling element that was inspired by the Western RPG series Wizardry, which had proven to be very popular among PC enthusiasts in Japan despite the language barrier presented at the time. These two changes wound up making Portopia's Famicom port hugely successful, its more mature subject matter and slower-paced gameplay proving itself uniquely appealing to the typically younger Famicom audience. It would go on to sell 700,000 copies on the Famicom and inspire some of the biggest names in the industry, such as Metal Gear and Death Stranding creator Hideo Kojima and the Legend of Zelda series director Eiji Aonuma in their own works. The success of Portopia on the Famicom convinced Enix to give the duo of Nakamura and Horii the green light on their RPG idea, because after all, if they could sell a near million copies of a mature menu-based game on the Famicom, what couldn't they do? The RPG project began development in earnest in 1985, with Nakamura primarily acting as support for Horii's vision. If this budding RPG was a car, then Horii was the engine that sent the vehicle forward, while Nakamura offered stability behind the wheel. Horii came up with the scenario, world design, monsters, weapons, spells, and more, while Nakamura made sure his ideas were feasible thanks to his coding and direction. One of Horii's first major decisions was the game's look and aesthetic. Instead of drawing upon more traditionally Japanese fantasy elements like ninja, samurai, and martial arts, he wanted the game to have a Western fantasy feel with swords and sorcery. He felt that it would better sell the adventure to Japanese youth that would be less familiar with the look and designs, piquing their curiosity and drawing them in. The traversal and combat are where Ultima and Wizardry's inspiration is felt the most. Ultima's movement and exploration in the overworld was top-down, so that's exactly how Horii decided to handle traversal. Overworlds, towns, and dungeons would be seen from a bird's-eye view, letting the player get a sense for where they were without revealing everything immediately. The combat was in turn inspired by Wizardry's approach, with random encounters viewed from a first-person perspective, letting the player see the monster attacking them up close and personal, along with the graphical effects that went into each fight. One of the major question marks when it came to copying these games was how Horii would simplify their systems for a console release. The PC RPGs the team was inspired by used the entire keyboard for their gameplay, with Ultima having players question NPCs using a text parser a la the Portopia Serial Murder Case's PC release, and Wizardry had players type the attacks they wanted to use next, whether in combat or exploration. Thankfully, Horii and Nakamura had already come up with the solution to this before ever starting on the development of the game, and that was thanks to the Famicom port of Portopia. Its menu-based navigation was exactly what was needed to simplify and streamline the game's systems into a digestible format. Speaking of digestible, the team was faced with another question when it came to where they would release the game. During development, the Famicom received the Disk System add-on, which allowed the Famicom to play games off of higher-capacity floppy disks. While releasing for the Disk System would have granted the team more freedom in the game's creation, Horii wanted to ensure as many people as possible could play the game without financial barriers restricting them. He elected to stick with the much smaller cartridges in order to reach the much larger market of base Famicom owners. This would prove a challenge as the size of the cartridge was a paltry 64 kilobytes. Imagine trying to fit an entire game, its dialogue, music, graphics, and codebase into that small of a space. For context, the most recent mainline Dragon Quest game, Dragon Quest XI's, is approximately 31 gigabytes when installed into your system's hard drive, which is 484,375 times larger than the space the original game was allowed. The team was more than okay making concessions for the sake of a wider release. It did mean they had to get creative when it came to the content in the game itself, such as extremely limited inventory, small pools of spells and items, and concise dialogue. Many of the game's enemies were recolors of each other, taking advantage of the Famicom's ability to flip sprites horizontally to create entirely new enemies with minimal strain on their storage. Because the game was produced for a cartridge instead of a disc, it meant the game couldn't traditionally save, and relied on passwords players would have to write down or remember in order to continue with their progress, lest it fade into the void with the system shut down. Perhaps the largest concessions made were the early removal of a class-changing system and multiple party members. Ultima and Wizardry both featured extensive character creation elements for the time, including character race and class, with Wizardry allowing you to create up to a 6-person party of custom characters, but the limited size of the cartridge meant it was going to be impossible for Horii to fully realize his vision, similar to the restrictions he faced when creating the Portopia serial murder case. Horii's creative inputs to the project were impressive, but there was one thing he wasn't capable of, and that was professional quality art for the game. While Horii did want to be a mangaka in his youth, he quickly realized it wasn't the career for him. He found writing more engaging and went to college to better his craft in it specifically. By the time he graduated, he was well versed in magazine work through both his school and professional outlets. One of the major publications that he worked for was Shonen Jump, a magazine that was aimed at young Japanese boys that has featured some of the most popular manga of all time, including My Hero Academia, Jujutsu Kaisen, Bleach, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Fist of the North Star, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Naruto, and One Piece. Horii was working for the magazine's video game column at the time, where he would cover Famicom games for the magazine's young audience, which were growing increasingly insatiable towards all things electronic entertainment. Horii's editor at the magazine was a man named Kazuhiko Torishima, a friend of Horii's who loved video games, more so than the manga he was being paid to edit. Torishima knew of the budding RPG project his friend and employee was developing, and saw opportunity for all parties involved. Shonen Jump was directly competing with several magazines at the time in video game coverage, and having exclusive first-hand coverage of a new video game would be incredibly unique and exciting for young boys interested to see how games came to life. The editor used his authority at Shonen Jump to assign its hottest author and illustrator to the title as a character designer, the late Akira Toriyama, known for his work on Dr. Slump, Sandland, and the international sensation that is Dragon Ball. Toriyama was at the peak of his powers as an author and artist, and his style was exactly what the game needed to stand out and attract audiences. While Horii provided rough conceptual sketches of the enemies, such as a ghost, a skeleton, and a golem, Toriyama turned these ideas into a ghost with a small hat, goofy grin and large tongue, a skeleton with an elongated skull and clothes, and a golem made of precise brickwork instead of the more common patchwork interpretations. First impressions are everything though, and most of the big video games from around this time understood that well. The Legend of Zelda's opening throws players into a vast wilderness with no weapons against the silly but deadly Octoroks. Mario being slowly approached by an angry-eyed Goomba with only one way around it, and Metroid started players in a room with little tools and only one way to go. Horii wanted players to encounter a simple enemy, one that was easy enough for players of all ages to dispatch even if they had no equipment purchased, and he wanted it to be obvious for every player that this enemy wasn't a genuine threat. His idea was a simple gelatinous slime, no larger than a house pet. When he gave Toriyama his concept for the enemy, Toriyama turned around and gave it two simple but distinct features that all but shaped Dragon Quest's identity forever. A simple teardrop shape that made the creature easy to draw and animate, and a silly wide-eyed smile that became instantly iconic. Toriyama's popularity as an artist certainly gave the game a celebrity status he would ever enjoy, but it was his design sensibilities and talent that gave Dragon Quest its unique visual identity, one that few other video game franchises could ever replicate. Speaking of celebrity status, Enix wasn't to be outdone when it came to finding big names to support their fledgling developers. In this case, it was through extremely fortunate happenstance. In the summer of 1985, Enix published a shogi game for PC called Morita Kazuro no Shogi. that caught the eye of a Japanese music composer, one who had been dabbling in video games and electronics both for his own personal enjoyment as well as professional curiosity. The shogi game was so entertaining to him that he decided to fill out the pack-in questionnaire that Enix used to gauge player feedback on their games, provided they were actually mailed in. The composer filled it out, but in a joking manner that was not meant to be taken seriously. He didn't even plan on mailing it in, but his wife saw the filled out paper on his desk and assumed he had intended on shipping it. When Enix saw the name attached to the paper, they quickly got in contact with the composer to confirm that yes, it was in fact the late famed composer, Koichi Sugiyama. Enix immediately offered him the chance to write music for their games, which Sugiyama accepted. He was intrigued and inspired by the limitations of the video game medium compared to traditional composing, but he was determined to make his work stand out just as much through the small sound chips compared to his larger, grander pieces with booming acoustics. Of course, it was fate that his first project would be the legendary title, Wingman 2. We all have humble beginnings. Sugiyama's work on the game impressed Enix though, and he was asked to come work on Dragon Quest because Enix themselves wasn't quite impressed with the soundtracks that Chunsoft had produced. When Sugiyama arrived at Chunsoft to introduce himself, Nakamura and his team were hesitant to agree to his involvement over his age. Chunsoft had been founded by and employed extremely young men, with Nakamura himself being 19 when he founded the company. Sugiyama was already in his 50s, and the massive generational gap was off-putting for the younger, more hot-blooded staff. Enix and Horii did what they could to act as intermediaries, and Sugiyama ended up bonding with the young men through stories of his own gaming escapades in his youth, driving to Yokohama after work to play pinball for hours at a time, similar to how a gamer of today would get lost behind a screen until the sun sets. When it came time to decide what Sugiyama would compose, Nakamura requested a rock and roll styled soundtrack, but one look at the setting and Toriyama's artwork told Sugiyama that wasn't a good idea. He pitched the idea of a more classical soundtrack and was able to compose the entire game's soundtrack in only a week. His work on the title wasn't limited just to its music though, as he would play the game himself and offer balance suggestions and playtested the game for any bugs. His willingness to assist combined with his own sensibilities and talent added another layer to the increasing legend that Dragon Quest was becoming. With everything locked in place, everything was queued up for Dragon Quest to be a success. An all-star staff, a supportive publisher, and exclusive coverage in one of the most popular magazines for gaming's biggest demographic. It was all lining up to become a monster hit. And sure enough, Dragon Quest sold over 1 million units in its first 6 months on store shelves, an astonishing number for what was seen as such a risky venture. Dragon Quest's popularity had Enix and Chunsoft starting work on a sequel before the first game even released, and a trilogy of titles by 1988. Dragon Quest's 1986 release was such a success that in 6 years, 5 mainline titles were released, a spin-off that not only spawned its own genre, but sub-series in that genre, and a remake that included the original Dragon Quest as a part of its package. The series was a tour de force in Japan. So why then have international audiences not been as captured by the series? That isn't to say there's no audience whatsoever, but Dragon Quest even today still has Japanese exclusive content and releases despite being published by a massive company who's more than capable of localizing it. When Dragon Quest finally got a fighter added to Smash Bros., the reception was more lukewarm in international communities compared to a character like Joker, who is the main protagonist of a single game at the time of his inclusion to the series. To answer that question, all we have to do is look at the release date for Dragon Quest in the United States. The original game came out in 1986, when the NES was a year old and games for the system were an extremely hot and novel commodity. Games looked like this, and Dragon Quest was one of the first RPGs released for the system. Of course, being a good game helped in its rise to popularity, but the chips were in its favor as well. By the time it reached US shores, the year was 1989. Oh boy. NES games now looked like this. The Sega Genesis was launching with 16-bit graphics, and multiple console RPGs had been localized and released across the NES and other systems. What Dragon Quest had inspired beat them to the punch, and such a late localization effort meant that it was going to appear antiquated and archaic, even if it was only 3 years later. But considering how quickly Enix and Chunsoft had been releasing titles, such a slow localization meant it was going to be coming into a vastly different landscape compared to the more hungry and eager audiences of 1986 Japan. The localization was also not handled by Enix in-house. The company wasn't able to publish games overseas due to not having a North American branch, so when the time came to bring Dragon Quest to Western households, who would have the honors of doing so? Nintendo themselves. Nintendo's success with The Legend of Zelda had inspired them to try their hand at bringing over other RPG series to Western markets, and what better series to start with than the inspiration for them all? But remember, by the time Nintendo even released the game in North America, Dragon Quest III was already out in Japan and capturing the imaginations of an entire generation. The decision to go with the first game, a title that had arguably been surpassed twice over in its own series, was a baffling one to say the least. But Nintendo was not the type to lazily port a game, and considering how much NES titles had progressed in the 3 years since Dragon Quest's initial release, they did make sure to invest proper resources into the effort to ensure it was at least up to snuff with other games releasing around the time. For example, in the original Japanese release, characters all faced one direction at all times no matter how they were moving in the overworld, but now would face the direction they walked to better sell their movement. Shorelines were given actual beaches to signify what they were instead of just cutting off in the water, the hero's sprite was updated to reflect when he had weapons equipped, and the game no longer relied on passwords for saves, instead featuring a battery backup to save across 3 files if need be. Location, spell, and character names were changed, with the main characters being switched from Lotto and Lara to Erdrick and Gwalin. Perhaps the most interesting was the choice to localize the dialogue into Elizabethan English, something the original Japanese release didn't feature. The dialogue in Japanese was very lighthearted, clever, and humorous. It felt appropriate for Toriyama's art style, since Dragon Ball began as a silly adventure manga, and his previous work on Dr. Slump was a straight comedy. Horii's writing was filled with puns, humor, and a tone that was more tongue-in-cheek than the straight-laced and serious localization of the North American version. Whether or not this is a bad thing is up to the reader, but I personally don't mind it in broad strokes. When all was said and done, Dragon Warrior was set to release in the summer of 1989, 3 years after its initial Japanese release. Yeah, so, about that title. This wasn't Nintendo of America trying to put their stamp on the game, at least more than they already had. Simply put, when Dragon Quest was being localized, Nintendo realized that a company called Tactical Studies Rules, the original creators of Dungeons & Dragons, produced a tabletop RPG called Dragon Quest at the same time, and owned the trademark to the name. Obviously, Nintendo wasn't about to fight in court over the name of a video game, so they renamed the title to Dragon Warrior, and that was that. However, there was one more decision that Nintendo made that I personally think harmed the sales of the game more than anything else. I've already discussed how iconic the late Akira Toriyama's work was as an artist. His art style and design sensibilities, even in his later years with the likes of Dragon Ball Super, are some of the most popular and iconic designs in anime, and when news of his passing was announced, the world itself paused to acknowledge the loss of such a powerful creator. So why then did Nintendo of America decide to put Dragon Warrior on the shelf with this box art? Why did the game's manual and advertisements make this seem like it was a title aimed at high fantasy fans? Remember, this was aimed at young boys, no older than elementary age. Of course, adults could enjoy it, but Dragon Quest found its popularity among younger kids, first and foremost in Japan. The choice to completely remove Toriyama's art from the promotional material gave the game a massive tonal dissonance, considering they didn't update the enemy sprites at all, so people would buy the game thinking it was a more serious and mature title, then find a game where the first enemies staring at you were goofy smiling blobs. All of these decisions came home to roost when Nintendo released the game to what can generously be described as lukewarm reception. Reception to the game was understandably mixed, and Nintendo ended up sitting on hundreds of thousands of unsold copies. Fortunately, Nintendo wasn't about to let these copies cuddle next to Atari's E.T. in the desert, instead taking a page from Kazuhiko Torishima's book. They would use Dragon Warrior to sell magazines. For a limited time, if you subscribed to the Nintendo Power magazine, you would not only get 12 months of the book, but a copy of Dragon Warrior with an official strategy guide that helped players through the entire game. This was an unabashed success, saving Nintendo from eating a massive loss on the game and drawing in fans who would have otherwise balked at paying full price for a title they didn't see as worth it. While Dragon Warrior may have limped across the finish line in the States and struggled to make a name for itself, Dragon Quest remains as one of the most iconic and important video games ever made. It may not be a spectacular, high-octane, and grand adventure like a lot of RPGs today, but its impact cannot be denied. I'm going to be looking at the North American Dragon Warrior today because I cannot read Japanese at all, and despite its commercial failure, it is arguably the definitive way to play the original NES release. This title theme is incredible. Sugiyama's work on this series is fairly divisive, to say the least, especially considering the trend for more bombastic, energetic, and cinematic scores for RPGs in the modern day, but I think his work on this game, as limited as it is good. Not great, as some of the songs loop far too quickly and aren't exactly catchy, but considering his goal of creating a classical score, I think he nailed it. First things first, we get to name our character. An interesting feature about this mechanic is that it does actually impact your stats ever so slightly. Not enough to make a huge difference, at least not in a casual run, but it can make two different playthroughs slightly different. When the game begins, players will find themselves in a throne room facing a king. He calls us the descendant of Erdrick, and tells us that our ancestors used to fight evil with a ball of light. But recently, the Dragon Lord has taken possession of this ancient artifact and hidden it away. He calls on us to find the orb and return peace to the land by defeating the Dragon Lord. He offers us his assistance through the objects in the chest before us and asking his guard for advice. And with that, our adventure begins. Now let's go grab those items out of the chest. Oh, why didn't that... Oh, okay. Yeah, so let's get this out of the way now. This game is extremely archaic in some aspects. Context-sensitive actions do not exist as they do today. If you press the A button, it will, without fail, pull up a menu of 8 actions: talk, spell, status, item, stairs, door, search, and take. Some of these are self-explanatory. Talk lets you talk to NPCs in front of you. Spell, cast any spells that you want on the overworld. Status lets you pull up your stats and equipment. Item is your consumable and key item menu. Search lets you check under your character's tile if there are any hidden items. And take lets you take any items you can see lying on the ground like chests. But 2 of these options are absolutely hilarious in retrospect. Stairs and door. You probably figured out what they do already, but if you didn't, door lets you open a door provided you have a key or it's already unlocked, and stair lets you go up or down stairs you're standing on. It's not automatic. I will be kind and not trash this design too much considering the context of when this game came out, but wow, are these 2 actions specifically the most silly and hilarious indications of this game's age. Hell, The Legend of Zelda released earlier in the same year and had context-sensitive doors and stair entrances. It's a very strange choice for stairs, especially considering the entire point of the game was to simplify actions for players unfamiliar with the genre. It's an easy enough mental hurdle to get over for now, but I can't imagine what people were thinking when they first played this game if they had prior experience with other NES games. Doing what the king says and talking to the guards in his throne room illuminates the situation for us a bit more. The king's daughter, Princess Gwaelin, was kidnapped along with the Ball of Light and stashed away in order to strike fear into the people. It's been 6 months since her disappearance, and no one has any leads on where she could be. Another guard gives us a good recommendation on how to use our initial money from the king: equipment. Despite our hero wearing what looks like a full suit of armor, he has nothing equipped to his person when the game begins. Fortunately, there's a town directly to the east we can go to that has more than enough equipment and items for us to purchase and stock up. Walking around Tantagel Castle and the initial surrounding area is a good way to get familiar with all of the game's systems without much risk. NPCs give helpful advice or further set the stakes against the Dragon Lord, the encounter rate is lower here than anywhere else in the game, and the only enemies you can encounter are the iconic slime and their slightly stronger sibling, the red slime, both of which can be beaten with no equipment whatsoever. Perhaps one of the best and understated parts of the game's design is when you leave Tantagel for the first time and can see another castle across the water surrounded by darkness. Charlock Castle, the home of the Dragon Lord, and our ultimate goal. It's a fantastic visual, one that games even today will harken back to in order to drive home the hero's journey. Of course, if you want to make fighting enemies easier and leave the safety of these early towns, we should heed the advice given to us and go to the town of Breckenary for equipment and items. Breckenary is also home to our only source of full healing at this point in the adventure, an inn that costs 6 gold to stay. While slimes aren't exceedingly dangerous, if you think you're too cool for school and forego buying equipment just to grind for later expensive equipment, you absolutely can, but be sure to use the inn lest your less than stellar defenses be whittled down. The equipment we can buy in this town range from the bamboo pole for 10 gold, a club for 60 gold, a copper sword for 180 gold, clothes for 20 gold, leather armor for 70 gold, and finally a small shield for 90 gold. I would recommend buying at least one piece of equipment, preferably a weapon and armor piece of some sort. Avoid the small shield for now, as you can find a better upgrade fairly soon that will last a good majority of the game and save you money now. Other shops in town are the Item Shop, which sells herbs that act as strong healing in the early game, and a good alternative to using your limited magic in the late game. Torches, which aren't required but I would recommend keeping at least one on you at all times for this early stretch of the adventure, since they illuminate dark areas for a paltry cost, saving you the headache of getting lost in unfamiliar caverns, and a Dragon Scale, which offers a slight buff to your defense and is the only example of a helpful accessory in this game. The final shop sells you fairy water, which acts as a repellent for enemies, and while I can understand the appeal of such an item in a game with random encounters, I never use this item for a variety of reasons. The biggest and most important one being Dragon Quest's main gameplay loop. Once you're geared up and feeling confident, it's time to explore the world beyond Tantagel. It's here you'll notice that the world of Alefgard is, for the most part, completely open to you. There's nothing stopping you from going to a good 80% of the map at the very start of the game. Towns are readily accessible, bridges and caves connect the landmass together in a horseshoe shape, and if you want, you can absolutely try to march to the Dragon Lord's castle with nothing but the scraps on your back. Good luck if you try that though, because you'll very quickly learn how Dragon Quest intends to impede your progress. Take a step in the wrong direction, typically over a bridge into another area, and you'll be greeted with stronger, more intense enemies that will spare no quarter in trying to rip you apart. And when you go to town and try to find stronger equipment to better combat these enemies, or fight weaker enemies to build your experience, levels, and gold to stockpile numbers, you've fallen into the gameplay loop. Dragon Quest combat is exactly what Yuji Horii wanted it to be when he set out to design an all-ages introduction to the RPG genre. It's extremely simple. A slime draws near, command, and then a menu pops up with our current level, health, MP, gold, and total experience points, and 4 commands that we can choose from: fight, spell, run, and item. Spell is a drop-down menu for the eventual spells we can learn, but at the moment it doesn't do anything for us. Item does the same thing it does in the overworld, allowing us to use consumable items, typically healing herbs, during our turn. Run is your escape tool, giving you a chance to retreat from a bad situation and heal outside of combat without risk of retaliation. Fight is the simplest one, where you simply click and watch our hero whack the enemy in front of them. And that's a very unique part of this game's combat, the fact that you only ever fight one enemy at a time. There are hordes of endless monsters, of course, but they only ever attack you at a single file line. Even more unique is that unless the enemy gains a surprise advantage, the hero will go first in most fights, giving players a very strong advantage provided they understand their situation and moveset. The decision-making at the micro level during fights is very low, obviously since this game was designed with a younger audience in mind. It's very easy to go dozens of fights without ever using more than the fight command, mindlessly tapping the A button until the enemy drops dead. It can be quite boring if you play conservatively, only venturing to harsher pastures when absolutely sure you can handle it. But that's where Dragon Quest progression truly shines. It's player-driven decision-making. The grind in Dragon Quest is required, that much is true. For a standard playthrough, it is considered impossible to beat the game until you are at least level 17, but most players would recommend 20 as a good breakpoint. Regardless, it is entirely possible for players to get very hard to reach areas if they're persistent and lucky enough. In fact, when I play this game nowadays, I find the most engaging way to do it is to push ahead as quickly as possible into difficult areas where enemies hit harder and I have less room for error, because said enemies drop more gold and experience, which allows me to scale faster both in stats and equipment and gain the biggest jump in power in the game: spells. The spells the hero can learn are absolutely game-changing. No longer are towns your only source of safety, because once you hit level 3, you can heal yourself with one cast of the heal spell. At level 4, you get the hurt spell, which does consistent damage for a low cost, meaning you can possibly forgo stronger offensive equipment to fling spells at enemies. At level 7, you learn the sleep spell, a spell I rarely used when I was younger, but came to greatly appreciate as I got older because sleep in this game is disgusting. With every fight being a one-on-one, if you put an enemy to sleep in this game, and they don't wake up the turn after, you gain a free turn of combat. The chance of the enemy waking up is a coin flip with no theoretical limit, so if you want to challenge your luck, you can fight extremely powerful enemies and win through the use of this spell. And that's where player decision-making comes into play. Do you want to sit back and fight weaker enemies with guaranteed safety near towns? Or do you want to push yourself across mountains and over rivers where more powerful enemies live at the risk of your own survival? It's one of the unique appeals of Dragon Quest compared to more modern contemporaries, in that it evokes the feeling of starting from zero and slowly testing your limits like in the survival genre. At the beginning, you're gaining your bearings and being conservative in order not to lose what little you have, but as you grow, you take larger and larger steps until you triumph or slam into a wall too tall to overcome. For now, anyway. Another thing this game does pretty expertly is how it handles dying. Tons of games in this era were known for their less than generous stance on failure, often forcing players to replay large chunks if not the entire game just to reach their previous point and try again. Dragon Quest opts to only send you back to Tantagel and take half of your money, with a pat on the back to send you on your way. While losing half of your money is annoying, especially if you're trying to earn the most expensive equipment in the game, I find this is a great way to not discourage failure but encourage better, smarter play. Of course, this is an early NES RPG, so sometimes you can just have garbage luck and lose through no fault of your own, but that's life. The game is smart enough to realize that one loss should not set a player back by hours and hours, and I appreciate it for that. One thing that might trip players up compared to other RPGs is that Dragon Quest does not feature dedicated save points, only one singular save point. By speaking to the king in Tantagel, he will tell you how much experience you still need to reach the next level, and save your progress should you choose to do so. This is the only way to save, so if you're grinding for equipment or need to step away from the game, this should be your last stop on the journey in case you lose half of your gold due to some unforeseen circumstances or flat out lose hours of progress. The open nature of the game means that it is possible to get to very difficult areas early, and while I do that on more casual runs of this game, I am going to cover the game through a more typical playthrough in order to properly represent it as it was intended and not the modern lens of a 40-year-old NES game that's been dissected to the individual binary digits. Leaving the immediate area around Tantagel, there's a cave directly north of some hills that we can enter. This is the first dungeon in the game, though it's a tad sparse on enemies. It acts more as a tutorial for navigating these dark labyrinths, where you can fumble around in the dark without being at risk of dying. Don't get used to that though, because every other dungeon in this game is full of enemies waiting to fillet you. Having a torch on you makes this segment a breeze, and once you've explored to the bottom of the cavern, you'll find a chest with an inscription that reads, "I am Erdrick, and thou art my descendant." 3 items were needed to reach the Isle of Dragons, which is south of Breckenary. I gathered these items, reached the island, and there defeated a creature of great evil. Now I have entrusted the 3 items to 3 worthy keepers. Their descendants will protect the items until thy quest leads thee to seek them out. When a new evil arises, find the 3 items, then fight. With that knowledge, we have a more direct goal that can help us reach and combat the Dragon Lord. By exploring the world, we can find towns like Garenham and Cole, which give us information on places like the Grave of Garen and Remulder, the latter of which is the first major milestone in terms of exploration. Reaching the town requires trekking through a poisonous swamp that damages you with every step and navigating a long cave with enemies, then exploring the southern island, which houses fairly strong enemies compared to what we've been fighting in the northern areas. Reaching Remulder, the town is full of people with helpful advice, as well as some humorous dialogue, like Howard the Wizard being a reference to beloved Nintendo employee Howard Phillips, who was the co-editor of Nintendo Power at the time of release, and known for his gameplay tips and tricks. Here he directly tells you how to find a magic item by going back to Cole and searching for it 4 steps south of where the town's bathhouse is. There's also a couple attempting to meet up with each other on opposite sides of town, wondering where the other is, which I think is my favorite bit of humor from the game, if only for the very real humor of assuming you and your partner are on the same wavelength and just not communicating about it. Besides the new weapons and armor you can find here, Remulder is most important for this place on the edge of town where a man lives alone. He sells keys that, just like the first door we opened in Tantagel, unlock any door we may come across. We can hold 6 at a time, and for your own sanity, I recommend always holding at least 1 on you for the rest of the game. The reason why is because unlike that first door in Tantagel, every door you unlock from here on out will reappear and need to be unlocked if you exit the screen they're on, making repeated trips to and from areas with locked doors somewhat of a hassle if you run out of keys and need to come all the way back here to get more. Traveling back to the previous towns and using the keys, we can find other NPCs, items like Howard told us about in Cole, which turns out to be a magic flute, and most importantly, the back entrance to Tantagel Castle, which houses another key salesman, and the first of the 3 artifacts Erdrick used to reach Charlotte Castle all those years ago. Heading back to the Grave of Garen, this is our first required dungeon of the game, and a fairly difficult one. Even entering this place requires some good sleuthing, as the entrance is hidden away behind a locked door, as well as a hidden tile that reveals the way. I would recommend coming in here around level 9 or 10, because it's at those levels you learn 2 very helpful spells. Radiant, which removes the need for torches since you can now cast a wider range of light without taking up inventory space, and the Stop spell, which negates enemy magic, including their own attempts at casting the Stop spell. Considering this place has enemies that cast sleep in here, it's a good tool to have. Navigating our way through the dungeon rewards us with the Silver Harp, an item we need to trade to prove our worthiness as a descendant of Erdrick. 2 more spells that are extremely helpful at this point in the game are Outside and Return. Outside won't get too much use since there's so few dedicated dungeons, but it does exactly what it says on the tin and warps you to the entrance of the dungeon you were just in. Return takes you back to Tantagel Castle as long as you're in the overworld, and considering it's the only place in the entire game you can save, it's a lifesaver if you want to get back to safety or need to quickly save out and quit the game. Once you have the Silver Harp and trade it for the Staff of Rain, we only need 1 more item to complete the trifecta Erdrick told us about in his message to us. This one is far and away the most challenging to find, as it involves a scavenger hunt on the most dangerous part of the map that isn't directly around Charlotte Castle. First things first though, I believe we have a princess that's in need of saving. By traveling to the poisonous swamp cave between Cole and Remulder, if you cast Radiant, you can see a pathway on the right side of the cave with a locked door. Now, God help you if you stumbled into this path on your first trips through here, whether on accident because you didn't have a torch or on purpose out of curiosity, because you know what they say curiosity does to cats. if you walk too deep into this path, you'll be greeted by a green dragon. This beast can absolutely wreck you at low levels with its fire breath and large health, so it's recommended you come here with some solid armor and spells at the ready, lest you become barbecue. But when you manage to slay the beast and unlock the door it was guarding, you can find Princess Gwaelin. Scooping her up in our arms after some light prodding from Her Highness, we take her back to Tantagel Castle and reunite her with her people and the king. While the king thanks us, Gwaelin gives us a parting gift as a profession of her love, literally called Gwaelin's Love. It acts similarly to the king, where Gwaelin herself will tell you how much experience you need to level up and exactly how far away you are from Tantagel Castle, or more specifically herself, presumably. The second part of this item won't make sense just yet, but it'll become clear as we continue the journey. Traveling to the farthest southern areas of the map lies a vast desert with a seemingly abandoned town beset by monsters with nothing for us, and another town walled off to the outside world and guarded by the only unique boss fight that isn't the Dragon Lord, the Golem. This massive stone beast hits like a truck and will kill you extremely quickly if you aren't careful. Fortunately, Howard's magic flute finally gets to be of use for us, as playing it puts this behemoth to rest and lets us attack it without a risk of it punching back. And if it wakes up again, play the flute again to tucker it out. This is perfectly winnable if you're a high enough level or have good enough equipment, but you are intended to use the flute to make this much easier and more manageable, though I can see some people considering this fairly gimmicky and lame considering it is a unique boss that's put down so easily. Our final populated town of the game is Cantlin, and this place is perfect as our final stronghold before taking on the Dragon Lord. It has the best purchasable weapons and armor in the game, every possible consumable you could reasonably need, as well as helpful NPCs that point us towards some of Erdrick's treasures he once used. The first of which is his legendary armor that lies in the town of Hawksnest on its eastern end. Well, there's only one town we visited that doesn't already have a name, so let's head back that way and dig a little deeper. Sure enough, we find an Axe Knight on the eastern side of town, the only monster of its kind here, which suggests it may be guarding something important. After dispatching it and searching beneath it, we find exactly what we came for and the best armor in the game, Erdrick's armor. Wearing it protects us from harmful effects such as poison or electric tiles, as well as healing us once per step taken, meaning in safe areas you can fully heal without the need to go to an inn. Unless you need MP, the armor can only do so much after all. With Erdrick's armor, you'd think that would be all we need to start our journey to the Dragon Lord, but not quite. Going back to Cantlin and asking around, we find a man who tells us to search exactly 70 leagues south and 40 leagues east of Tantagel Castle. Whatever that means. Yes, if you remembered earlier, we can use Gwaelin's Love to tell us where we are in relation to Tantagel, and by searching there, we can find the last item Erdrick trusted us to find, Erdrick's token. Travel to the south of Remulder and show the man the token, and he'll take the Sunstone and Staff of Rain to create the Rainbow Drop. Heading towards the closest point to Charlock Castle and using the drop, we can create a bridge that connects us to the island housing the Dragon Lord and make our final push towards him, theoretically. It's at this point where Dragon Quest's design flaws start to rear their head a little bit. The first being the poor pacing of the latter half of the game. While early on in the game, a grinding session would take no more than an hour, and that was only if I was being thorough in my experience or gold grind, the final boss of this game is an absolute monster that is impossible for a normal player to beat without a sheer numbers advantage. When I reached the Dragon Lord's castle for the first time, I was level 15, with my highest level spell being Repel, a spell that repels enemies weaker than me. Not very helpful. The final two spells in the game are the most powerful, being Heal More at level 17 that can heal up to 5 times the amount of the heal spell, and Hurt More at level 19 that hurts more. Even if I went into the fight at level 17, my health and defensive numbers wouldn't be high enough to be consistently safe from the Dragon Lord's onslaught, so I opted to grind to level 19 to at least have access to every spell. Going from level 15 to 19 is 12 4,000 experience points, which doesn't really illuminate the context of the situation. To get to level 15 from level 1, it's 10,000 experience points. I had to gain an additional 120% of my current experience points just to have a chance to beat the final boss. And while there are more powerful enemies in Charlotte Castle that can rip your ass a new one if you aren't careful, their experience gain isn't so great that it's worth the risk, so you'll probably be fighting enemies on the earlier floors of the castle, around the castle, or near Cantlin. But no matter what, you will be running around mashing the A button for multiple hours waiting for your numbers to get higher. This is also where Dragon Quest exploration falters, because while the game's open nature was very impressive and innovative for the time, what you can actually collect outside of required story items is very lacking. Enemies never drop items, only gold, and the items you can collect in chests amount to things you can already find in shops or items that range from harmful, like the cursed belt or the exceedingly rare cursed necklace, which I didn't even find in this playthrough, to the useless fighter's ring. In fairness, this ring is supposed to raise our attack slightly upon equipping it, similar to the dragon scale, but due to a coding error, it does nothing, and in turn makes an entire optional dungeon nearly pointless. Actually, that's a lie. The Mountain Cavern may not have any good items in it, but it does lead into one of this game's funnier glitches. Because of how the game stores chest data, if you go into the mountain cave with at least one key, and open a couple of chests and then die without leaving the dungeon, you will be teleported back into Dantigel Castle. Heading down and to the left into this locked room, you can open some chests to find small amounts of money that are normally supposed to disappear after you open them. But if you did the trick correctly, the chests will stick around and allow you to open them again. And again. And again. Endlessly. Congratulations, you have an infinite money glitch and have destroyed Alefgard through hyperinflation. Of course, by this point in the game, the trick is entirely pointless, since you'll more than likely have the best purchasable equipment, and if not, it's more efficient to grind enemies to get gold and experience at the same time and boost your levels as well. The only thing worth doing in this final grinding session is to go into Charlotte Castle and explore it for the second half of Erdrick's equipment, his legendary sword, the strongest weapon in the game, and one I heavily recommend to cut down on your grinding time. Charlotte Castle is a giant maze filled with enemies, of course the strongest in the game, some of which are unique to this area. It starts with enemies we've seen before in greater numbers, like the Green Dragon and Axe Knights, but it eventually throws blue dragons and stone men at us that hit harder and harder the farther down into the dungeon we go. If you find your way to the 5th floor of the castle and find a stairway heading up, then follow that linear pathway, you will find Erdrick's sword, by far the strongest weapon in the game and one we need to make saving Alefgard in a reasonable time a possibility. After reaching level 19, I finally decide it's time to go face the Dragon Lord. I journey through Charlock, battling the increasingly intense baddies until I get to the bottom of the castle, an open and lit area compared to the dimly lit corridors of before. It's here where the toughest enemies in the game lie in wait. Red Dragons and Armored Knights. Fortunately, I should be okay. I am rocking the strongest spells in the... Okay, that was a fluke. Let me try again. Fine! 4,000 more experience points later and we're level 20. This should be strong enough to at least reach the Dragon Lord. And it is. When we reach him at his throne, he introduces himself and has a proposition for us. If we stand beside him instead of fighting, he will let us rule half of the world with him. Of course, we're a great hero, one trusted by the people of the world to save the land, so we tell him to take his offer and shove it. He calls us a fool and begins to attack us. The Dragon Lord doesn't inspire much fear, with only one attack capable of truly damaging us being hurt more. He does have access to other magics such as the stop spell, but Erdrick's armor protects us from those effects. Once we bring him down, the Dragon Lord gets back up and reveals his true form to us. This fight is the hardest fight in the game, and one that you need to be prepared for coming in, otherwise you'll lose pretty quickly. The Dragon Lord hits with a lot of force, up to 50 to 60 damage if you aren't lucky, so make sure when you begin this fight you're as healed as possible. From there, your only strategy should be to attack him when your health is above 60, and then cast Heal More on yourself to avoid staying in one-shot range. If you reach this fight and don't have enough MP, you won't be able to outlast the onslaught and will go down. It's unfortunate because the music for this fight is great for the NES, but the fight itself is basically a numbers game with very little strategy to it. You can try to put the boss to sleep, but the chances of it are exceedingly rare, and it's better to act as if you only have Heal More in your spell list for this fight. Otherwise, the fight consists of you hitting attack unless you need healing, then attacking until the Dragon Lord goes down. When he does finally go down, we're teleported outside of Charlotte Castle and able to walk around the overworld again. As we wander back towards the towns we've saved, you might notice the lack of enemy encounters, and that's because with the Dragon Lord's defeat, we've driven them all away. This is the only time in the game you can travel to every point on the map with no monsters whatsoever, so if you want to travel to Cantland without worrying, now's the time. You can talk to the NPCs to hear a few lines of dialogue thanking you, but a lot of it is the same repeated stock lines, so it loses its luster fairly quickly. Personally, I would check out Remulder, then return to Tantagel to give yourself a taste of the intended victory lap. When you do return to Tantagel, the king is waiting for you at the bottom of the steps of the throne room, ready to congratulate you. He recognizes us as a descendant of Erdrick, and offers us his place on the throne as its rightful heir. And for the only time in the game, our character speaks. I cannot. If ever I am to rule a country, it must be a land that I myself find. Gwaelin comes down the stairs, asking us to please wait before leaving. She wants to come with us on our journey. Something tells me she won't take no for an answer. With her at our side, the castle guard begins to play a tune celebrating the defeat of the Dragon Lord and the dawn of a new day, while ushering in the credits. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest is one of those really special games that when you know about the history going into it and what came out of it, it really makes it special. Award-winning RPG titles of today share DNA with Dragon Quest, and whether they know it or not, owe a lot of their success to this series and this game specifically. It's not a perfect game, as I already mentioned a lot of its flaws like its awkward pacing, lackluster combat, and poor incentives outside of the main story quest, but no video game series starts out perfect in its first entry, especially not one from the 1980s. But considering how this game is turning 40 this year, and just how much it has inspired in video games and beyond, I think it would be a disservice not to check it out. If not the original version, then the Game Boy Color, mobile, or Switch ports are all excellent ways to play it as well. They update the scripts to better reflect modern Dragon Quest, though the Game Boy port had to rename everything due to the smaller screen space, but their main improvements lie in fixing the pacing issues of the original, making enemies drop more gold and experience upon defeat. It doesn't change the fundamental progression or experience, only makes it go by faster without wasting as much time as the original did, and I think that's a great way to update the game. Personally, I would recommend the Switch port, since it's only $5 and quite easy to pick up and play, especially if you have 5 minutes. You can easily make your way to a town while fighting enemies along the way, and then set the game down without burning out. The newer versions also sport quick saves if you want to put the game down for an extended period and come back without losing progress, making them the most friendly for a shared system or someone wanting to take an extended break without resetting their progress. Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura's baby was, as I discussed earlier in the video, a bona fide success. It paved the way for so many games and series that I and many others absolutely adore and cherish, and while Dragon Quest the game might not be my favorite ever, I can't deny its impact, and I especially can't deny the fun I have occasionally sitting down to replay it. I played this on original hardware for this video because it felt right, both for the 40th anniversary, as well as really immersing myself in Horii and Nakamura's mindset when crafting this game. Seeing the world through their eyes, the joy and wonder they hope to inspire in so many, And while yes, the game did annoy me at a couple of points, the smile I had on my face when I beat the Green Dragon and saved Waylon, beat the Golem without taking any damage at all, and went out of my way to take notes and write down helpful tips from the NPCs like I didn't have internet helped me appreciate the good that this game did. It distilled the RPG genre down to its bare essentials and made them digestible, not just for a young audience, but every possible audience without talking down to them. It doesn't hold your hand or patronize you, allowing you to make mistakes, dust yourself off, and try again without a hint of judgment or malice. It is a game that wants you to succeed, but it won't hand you the keys to it. Like life, you have to make your own path to victory, and how you do that is entirely up to you. You can go anywhere and do anything, provided you are smart, make a plan, and commit to your decisions in an intentional and intelligent way. It's not the perfect video game, but it's exactly the one the industry needed in 1986. Here's to another 40 years of Dragon Quest. May the light shine upon thee.